Building efficient workflows to handle common automation tasks can often lead to overcomplication. A perfect example of this is how many teams rely on AWS Lambda combined with EventBridge for orchestration. While these tools offer tremendous capabilities, I've seen firsthand how they can introduce unnecessary complexity, especially when the tasks are predictably scheduled. Here's the story of how I replaced three separate cron jobs and an AWS Lambda with a single n8n workflow, a switch that streamlined our operations and saved both time and cost in the long run. In my previous role, we were managing various scheduled tasks for an e commerce platform that involved data synchronization, inventory checks, and reporting. Each task was handled by its own cron job, leading to a control panel cluttered with schedules and dependencies across AWS Lambda functions. It was all neatly tied into AWS EventBridge for triggering those Lambda functions, which on paper sounds efficient. But let's talk about the reality. Three separate cron jobs running every hour meant we had multiple logs, multiple monitoring setups, and a hefty bill racking up from our Lambda usage. Each function could take anywhere from 200 to 500 milliseconds to execute, depending on the payloads processed. And while the cost per execution of Lambda can seem negligible at first, aggregate costs piled up surprisingly fast. A running total showed we were spending about $150 a month just on Lambda executions. It felt wasteful. The solution was simpler than I initially expected. By employing n8n, we tapped into a visual workflow automation tool that allows for easy orchestration. The first step was to model our tasks in n8n. Using n8n's native integrations, we crafted a single workflow that encapsulated the logic of all three cron jobs and the Lambda function. Each task of syncing data, checking inventory, and generating reports was linked logically, significantly minimizing the number of places we needed to go for monitoring and maintenance. One of the first challenges was mapping out the timing. Each of the previous cron jobs had different schedules. One was hourly, another ran every 15 minutes, and a third executed daily. n8n offered scheduling options that could handle this complexity in one workflow efficiently. Instead of checking the job scheduling and dependencies, n8n allowed us to trigger operations based on the output of the preceding step, keeping everything linear and easy to follow. What about execution times? The n8n workflow optimized the individual actions to run in parallel when possible. Where earlier we were looking at a cumulative delay of 1-2 seconds due to sequential execution in Lambda, n8n managed to cut it down to under a second for the entire operation, even at peak loads. This is an improvement of roughly 50-70% in efficiency, which is significant when your tasks impact live customer interactions. Another aspect worth discussing is observability. With multiple cron jobs, we relied on CloudWatch to monitor and log outputs separately. Combining everything in n8n allowed us to centralize logging within the n8n dashboard. By doing so, we simplified debugging. Previously, if an issue occurred, it could take hours to trace back through various logs across multiple environments. Now we could pinpoint failures and the specific task that faltered in a matter of minutes. One trade off to consider was handling state. Running multiple serverless functions like Lambda maintained stateless operations, which meant that scaling wasn't an issue. However, executing in a single n8n instance meant that we had to be cautious with scaling. For minor adjustments, n8n's scaling capabilities can be restrictions, but for our needs, we were well within operational limits, never exceeding a load that would pose issues. Finally, let's not overlook the cost factor. Transitioning from the Lambda model to n8n reduced our monthly operational cost down to approximately $40. That's a staggering nearly 70% reduction in expenditure dedicated solely to task orchestration. In a budget conscious environment, that difference is crucial, allowing us to allocate resources elsewhere. Adopting tools like n8n for orchestration isn't just about reducing AWS costs or simplifying workflows. It's about making your tech stack more manageable and comprehensible to the team. It's about solidifying a workflow that can easily adapt to changes in requirements rather than scrambling to adapt a complex orchestration using Lambda and EventBridge. For engineering managers and team leads, tools like n8n represent an avenue to reduce friction and improve responsiveness while maintaining a focus on practical results rather than over engineered solutions. As I wrap up this exploration of shifting from AWS Lambda and multiple cron jobs to a centralized n8n workflow, remember that simplicity often wins in production environments. TH subscribe for more.